They were old, quiet, and kind, the kind of couple everyone in the neighborhood knew but rarely noticed. For over 40 years, Walter and Lillian Johnson had lived in the same small house on a tree-lined street, filling it with laughter, Sunday dinners, and the warmth of family. But one morning, everything changed. A letter on their doorstep. Cold, official, and final. The words on that paper didn't just threaten to take their home, they threatened to erase their history. Neighbors watched in silence as unfamiliar cars started showing up. People took pictures, measured walls, and marked boundaries. Within days, the couple's peaceful life turned into a nightmare of phone calls, legal notices, and whispered prejudice. They had nowhere to go and no one to turn to, or so everyone thought. Because just when the world decided they didn't belong anymore, someone unexpected came back. And what happened next would remind everyone that love, loyalty, and justice never grow old. For Walter and Lillian Johnson, life had always been simple, but meaningful. Their days started early, with the soft creak of old floorboards and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through a kitchen lined with family photos. Theirs was the first black family to move onto Maplewood Lane back in the late 70s. It wasn't easy then, and it wasn't always kind, but they stayed. They built a home, raised children, and watched the seasons change through the same worn window that once framed their dreams. Walter, a retired mail carrier, still woke up at 6 every morning. Habit, he'd say. He'd step out onto the porch, greet the neighbors, and water the same patch of grass he'd cared for decades. Lillian spent her mornings tending to her roses, her pride and joy. She'd talk to them softly, believing they bloomed brighter when they felt loved. To most, the Johnsons were just a sweet old couple. But to those who knew them, they were pillars of quiet dignity. The kind of people who believed that goodness, no matter how small, still mattered in a world that often forgot. But lately, small things had started to change. Notices pinned to doors down the block. New construction signs popping up overnight. Strangers walking through backyards with clipboards and measuring tapes. The old community was slowly vanishing, replaced by sleek houses and unfamiliar faces. Then came the day Walter found that envelope on their porch. It looked like junk mail at first, until he saw the bold red letters, Notice of Removal. At first, they thought it was a mistake. They'd paid their taxes. The house was theirs, bought fair and square decades ago. But the more they tried to call, the less anyone seemed to listen. Each phone number led to another department. Each visit to City Hall ended with cold stares and hollow promises. Still, Walter kept believing it would sort itself out. After all, they'd faced worse before. But Lillian could feel it deep down, her neighbors were different. Something wasn't right. She'd catch the way certain neighbors avoided their eyes. The way the mail started arriving later and later. The way one of the new property managers looked at them, as if they didn't belong there at all. What the Johnsons didn't know was that the paper in Walter's trembling hands was more than just a notice. It was the start of a plan, a quiet, calculated attempt to erase everything they'd built. And soon, their fight to keep their home would become something much bigger than they ever imagined. The first sign that things were turning against them came quietly. One morning, Walter went out to get the mail and saw a white truck parked across the street. 2 men in hard hats stood beside it, pointing toward his house. He waved politely. They didn't wave back. Later that day, a notice appeared on their door again, this time, laminated. Final property evaluation, it read. No return address. No name. Just another warning that their home now fell under new ownership plans. Walter tried to stay calm. He'd always believed in doing things the right way. He gathered every old document he could find, receipts, title deeds, and tax statements, each one a piece of proof that the home was theirs. Lillian watched him sort through the papers with trembling hands. She didn't say much. She just knew the look in his eyes, the same mix of confusion and pride she'd seen years ago when they'd first moved into a neighborhood that didn't want them. The next day, they went to the county office. The clerk barely looked up. Looks like the land's being rezoned, she said flatly. Your name isn't on the new registry. Walter frowned. That can't be right. We've owned that house since 1979. She shrugged. You'll have to speak to the developer. But no one would tell them who that was. Days turned into weeks. Strangers came by to take pictures, peek over fences, and measure the property lines again and again. The Johnsons' once quiet street was now filled with construction noise, but their small home stood untouched, like an island waiting to be swallowed. Then one morning, Walter found their mailbox torn off and lying in the yard. No one saw who did it. That same week, the city trash collectors stopped picking up their garbage. Calls went unanswered. When Lillian walked to the market, she overheard whispers, they should have moved out already, that old couple's just being difficult. The walls of their world were closing in, one quiet act at a time. Still, they refused to leave. Walter fixed the mailbox himself, painted the porch again, and trimmed the hedges as if holding on to normalcy could somehow make the nightmare disappear. Lillian prayed every night, whispering that maybe, just maybe, someone would step in before it was too late. But the day the demolition signs appeared, she stopped praying. Yellow boards, nailed into the ground in front of their fence, scheduled for removal, October 3rd. That was the day something inside Walter broke. Not from fear, but from the realization that this wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Their names, their lives, their legacy were being erased, paper by paper, order by order. He went to the mayor's office himself. Waited hours just to be told, there's nothing we can do. A week later, a city truck parked in front of their house, engines idling. Walter stood on the porch, arms crossed, staring them down. The driver rolled his window down. We'll be back with a crew next week, he said, smirking. That night, Lillian sat at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. They are going to take it, Walter, she whispered. Everything. Walter didn't answer. He just looked at the framed photos on the wall, faces of the children they'd fostered and adopted through the years. Each one had come to them broken, lost, unwanted. And in this house, they'd found love. A real home. He picked up one of the photos, their eldest daughter, Monica. She'd left years ago, built a successful career in another city, rarely visited because she didn't want to burden them. But that night, Walter finally made a call he'd been avoiding. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, Dad. Walter hesitated, his voice trembling. They are trying to take our home, baby. There was silence on the other end, then a steady, controlled breath. Who's trying to take it? She asked. Walter didn't know yet. But what he did know was this: he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Because once those children, the ones they'd raised with nothing but love, found out what was happening, they wouldn't let it end quietly. And when they returned, the city that once ignored the Johnsons would finally have to listen. The morning of the eviction was quiet, too quiet. The air carried that heavy stillness that comes before a storm. Walter stood on the porch in his best shirt, hat in hand, the same one he'd worn when he first bought the house 40 years ago. Beside him, Lillian clutched the family Bible to her chest. Her lips trembled, but she stood tall, refusing to let fear show on her face. Down the street, engines growled. A line of city trucks turned the corner, followed by 2 police cars. Behind them came a sleek black SUV, the kind that didn't belong in their neighborhood. Out stepped the developer, flanked by lawyers in expensive suits and a small crowd of curious onlookers. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, the man said with a rehearsed smile, we've given you every opportunity to leave peacefully. Walter didn't answer. He just looked at the man, his eyes hard and tired. This is our home, he said quietly. We're not leaving. The officer beside the developer sighed, checked his clipboard, and gave a nod. Workers began unloading equipment. One man walked toward the house with a bright orange spray can, ready to mark the walls for demolition. Lillian's voice broke. You can't do this. This is our life. The crowd shifted. Some watched with pity, others with silent judgment. But then, a sound cut through the noise. A car door slammed. Then another. And another. 3 black SUVs pulled up at the end of the street. Doors opened, and one by one, the Johnsons' children stepped out. Monica led the way, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her expression cold and focused. Behind her came David, their youngest, with a camera crew in tow. Their adopted family, grown now, strong, successful, and unafraid, formed a wall between the workers and the house. Monica raised her voice. "You touch 1 inch of this property, and you'll be on national news before sunset." The developer hesitated. "Who are you?" "I'm Monica Johnson," she said. "Attorney at law. And this is my parents' home." The tension was electric. Police radios crackled. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Someone began recording on their phone. Monica stepped closer, her tone razor-sharp. "You've violated due process. You falsified ownership records. And you targeted my parents because you thought they wouldn't fight back." The developer opened his mouth, but no sound came. The cameras were already rolling. The officer lowered his clipboard. The workers froze. Lillian's hands shook as she looked at her children, standing tall, defiant, unmovable. Walter's eyes filled with tears, but his chin lifted with pride. For the first time in weeks, he felt the ground beneath him again. Monica turned to her parents. "You're not losing your home," she said softly. "Not today. Not ever." And then, as the crowd watched in stunned silence, she walked past the police tape and stood on the porch beside her father, where it all began. The developer muttered something to his lawyers and turned away. The trucks reversed. The workers packed up. But the cameras kept rolling, and the story was already spreading. 4 years, the Johnsons had been unseen, ignored, silenced. But that day, their story became a symbol of something bigger than one family's fight. What started as an eviction was turning into a movement. And the city that once tried to erase them was about to learn what happens when love, justice, and truth finally come home. The next morning, the street was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't silence born of fear. It was peace. The demolition trucks never came back. The signs were gone. And for the first time in months, the Johnsons' home stood without threat, a small, weathered house that had just won the biggest fight of its life. Within days, the video of that confrontation spread everywhere. News anchors replayed the moment Monica stepped in front of the bulldozers. Social media called her the daughter who stopped an eviction. But for the Johnsons, it wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about finally being seen. The city opened an investigation. The developer's permits were revoked. Officials who had signed off on the paperwork quietly resigned. And the Johnsons, after months of fear, were officially reinstated as the rightful owners of their home. Walter spent the next morning on the porch, watching the sun rise like he always did. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. Not exhaustion. Not anger. Just peace and pride. Lillian joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. The roses she'd nearly given up on were blooming again, bright and full of life. Their children visited every weekend now. The house that almost became rubble turned into a symbol, a reminder of what love and unity could do against injustice. But underneath that victory was a deeper truth. Their story wasn't rare. Across towns and cities, families just like theirs were losing everything, not because of laws or luck, but because of systems that quietly decided who belonged and who didn't. Walter knew that. He'd lived it his whole life. One evening, as the camera crew returned to film a follow-up piece, a reporter asked him, "What kept you going when everyone told you to give up?" He smiled faintly. "Because this house wasn't just wood and bricks," he said. "It was where we built our lives. Where we taught our kids that doing right matters, even when it costs you. And if we gave up on that, what lesson would that teach them?" That clip became the story's heart. Viewers everywhere shared it, each captioned with their own thoughts, their own memories of injustice faced or witnessed. People donated, protested, and pushed for change. The Johnsons' fight became more than a headline, it became a spark. And though Walter and Lillian didn't seek attention, they understood the power of what they'd started. Because standing your ground, even when the world wants to push you out, is more than resistance, it's legacy. Months later, a small plaque was placed outside their home by the local community. Here stood a family who refused to be erased. Walter would touch it sometimes, quietly, when no one was watching. Lillian would smile, watering her roses like always. Their house still creaked in the mornings. The same sunlight still streamed through those old windows. But everything about it now meant more, because they'd proven something simple, yet profound. When you fight for what's right, even the smallest home can shake an entire city. And maybe that's the question we all have to ask ourselves. When the next injustice unfolds quietly on someone else's doorstep, will we look away? Or will we show up, like their children did, and help them stand? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that remind us what truly matters. Now tell me, where are you watching this from?